Have you ever found yourself in a situation where people underestimated you? Where someone passed judgment without knowing a single thing about who you are or the path you've walked? Imagine sitting in a courtroom, all eyes on you, and the one man whose opinion could change the course of your life, dismissing you with a glance, with a smirk, with sheer arrogance. Now imagine the tables turn, and it's suddenly your turn to call the shots. In a small town, tucked away where time seemed to move slower than it should, a scene was playing out inside a courthouse, one that no one in the room that day would ever forget. It started as any other morning in Judge Malcolm Granger's courtroom. Orderly, controlled, predictable. The room was filled with people. Some were there out of a desperate hope for justice. Others simply counting the minutes until they could move on with their tedious lives. But there was one person who was about to make this day unforgettable. At the front of the courtroom, seated behind an elevated mahogany bench, was Judge Granger. His reputation preceded him. A man who had seen it all, or at least he thought he had. His hair was a sharp contrast of steel gray against dark mahogany paneling behind him, his face carved by years of stern expressions and narrowed glances. He was a man of strict routine, of rigid beliefs. In his mind, people who sat in the defendant's chair were often guilty long before they even spoke a word. Today would be no different, or so he thought. His narrowed gaze landed on the woman seated at the defense table. She was composed, still as stone, her back straight, her chin lifted. Her name was Serena Mitchell. She wasn't flashy, not in the least. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, the kind that said she was there for business, not drama. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat, no-nonsense twist, and her hands were clasped calmly in front of her. But it was something about her presence, something unspoken, that immediately disrupted the rhythm of Granger's morning. And he didn't like it. With a huff that carried more judgment than any verdict he'd ever given, Judge Granger flipped open the folder in front of him. His fingers drummed an impatient beat on the bench. He scanned the file, his lips curving ever so slightly into a smirk. "Another case of entitlement," he muttered, loud enough for anyone paying attention to hear. "Another one who thinks the rules don't apply." The air in the courtroom shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Some of the people sitting in the pews glanced at one another, sensing something wasn't right. But Serena? She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She remained perfectly still, almost as if she'd expected this. Judge Granger leaned forward. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "are you here to tell us you were wrongfully arrested?" His question hung in the air, loud enough for everyone to hear, drawing a few stifled chuckles from the gallery. But Serena's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't offer excuses. She smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not one that begged for mercy. No, this was the quiet, unsettling smile of someone who knew something everyone else didn't. And it rattled Granger, though he tried hard not to show it. The young prosecutor, a man barely into his 30s named Thomas Avery, cleared his throat. He was trying to steady the tension beginning to bubble in the room. "Your Honor, if I may." But Judge Granger cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "We won't waste the court's time," he said, his voice dismissive. "Miss Mitchell, why don't you enlighten us? Why do you think you're special?" Serena's voice was smooth, controlled. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her eyes unwavering, "I prefer to deal in facts, not opinions." Her words, simple as they were, sent an almost imperceptible ripple through the room. Granger's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Then he leaned back, as if settling in for a performance. "Facts, is it?" he echoed mockingly. "All right, Miss Mitchell, let's hear your facts." Serena moved then, slowly, deliberately. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. The bailiff, standing by the wall, stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of his holstered weapon. Granger opened his mouth, prepared to bark out some sarcastic comment about courtroom decorum. And then she pulled out something small. Black. Leather. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. With meticulous care, she opened the case. Inside lay a badge, gleaming, unmistakable. But this wasn't just any badge. It was the kind of badge that carried weight, that demanded respect. Special Agent Serena Mitchell, United States Secret Service. For a moment, no one spoke. No one could. Granger's face drained of color. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. Thomas Avery's pen slipped from his hand, clattering noisily against the table. The entire room, once filled with suppressed giggles and murmurs, fell into absolute silence. Serena set the badge on the defense table in front of her, like a poker player laying down the winning hand. "My name," she said, her voice calm and steady, "is Special Agent Serena Mitchell, United States Secret Service." The weight of her words settled in the air like a heavy fog. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then came the frantic rustle of paper as Thomas Avery scrambled through his files. His mind raced. How had he missed this? How had he failed to recognize her? His stomach churned with realization and dread. Serena let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Before we proceed," she said slowly, her gaze fixed on the judge, "it's important to note that my arrest wasn't just unjustified. It was illegal, a direct violation of federal law." The words cut through the courtroom like a razor. Judge Granger, the same man who moments before had exuded smug superiority, now looked stricken. The color drained further from his face. But Serena wasn't finished. She reached into her bag again, and this time pulled out a thick, sealed folder. Without a word, she slid it across the table toward Thomas Avery. He stared at it for a long moment before finally opening it with trembling hands. "This," she said, "is an official complaint drafted by the Department of Justice. It details the numerous violations committed by the officers who arrested me, including falsified reports that somehow made it to this courtroom." A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. People shifted in their seats, their earlier amusement vanishing as the reality of the situation settled in. Judge Granger's hands trembled. His arrogance had evaporated. All that remained was the stark, unrelenting truth. He had misjudged her. And now it was his judgment under scrutiny. Serena's tone remained calm, but her words were sharper than any gavel strike. "You see, Your Honor," she said, "the officers who arrested me never even checked my credentials. They made assumptions based solely on how I look." A fresh wave of discomfort swept over the room. Thomas Avery's face reddened as he flipped through the evidence in front of him. He glanced from the folder to the judge, then back at Serena, realization dawning in his eyes. Serena's gaze remained locked on Granger. "And now," she continued, "I find myself in front of a judge who mocked me." Before hearing a single piece of evidence, the room was still, so still that every breath seemed too loud. Judge Granger looked older now, weaker. In that moment, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted. The tables had turned. Serena adjusted her blazer, straightened her shoulders. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice carrying weight. "This is about a system that allows people in power to abuse that power without consequence." She leaned forward just slightly. "But today, Judge Granger, you picked the wrong person." Thomas Avery shot to his feet. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, the prosecution requests all charges against Agent Mitchell be dropped immediately." Granger opened his mouth, closed it, then cleared his throat. "Case dismissed," he muttered, his voice hollow. His gavel came down with a thud, but for the first time, it wasn't his authority that held sway over the room. It was hers. Serena gathered her belongings with measured precision. She stood, smoothing her suit as she did, and turned to leave. But at the doorway, she paused, glancing back at the people who had filled that room with laughter at her expense. "Next time," she said, her words crisp and deliberate, "think before you laugh." And then she was gone. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind her with a finality that echoed in Judge Granger's ears. He sat there, pale, humiliated, knowing, without question, that his career was over. And it wouldn't be long before the world would hear about the woman who turned the tables in that courtroom.